Let's actually dig into color correcting in Premiere Pro. We spent the first half of this course getting our head wrapped around scopes and color temperature and light and some of the nuances in shooting. Now let's look at how we can fix all those things that I ignored when I actually shot this footage. So the main thing we're going to be working with is a very specific effect called the LumetriColorEffect. Now this came out, I'm guessing, a couple of years ago in one of the Premiere Pro CC updates. If you are using, we had some people who were using other older versions of Premiere, or they were using Premiere Elements. The LumetriColorEffect is probably not available in those. So there are other color correcting tools, and you can use some of the examples that I'm working with, but you probably have to use multiple tools instead of this one streamlined tool. But I just wanted those who had earlier versions to be aware that they're not finding it because it's not there within their application. So let's take a look at some problematic footage and how I might fix it. And in some cases that the quick fixes may or may not help. So here's a shot, and I spend a lot of time in hotel rooms and I often try to shoot time lapses outside the window of hotel rooms. And this was yet another beautiful shot through a green tinted window. So everything is kind of muted. It's a little blue-green. It's really not color balanced. Look at the contrast here. My contrast is fairly horrid. I can look at the color cast and I can see that what should probably be a generic blob in the middle is definitely going down towards the cyan with a little bit of blue. And here, again, I see I'm losing a lot of reds. Probably have the right amount of greens, but I have a little bit too many or too much blue. So let's take a look at what I would do. The first thing when I color correct anything is I work with the luminance, because as you make an image brighter, and I indicated this right before the break, colors actually look less saturated, and the problem may go away. You may not even see the issue. If I'm making something darker, colors will be more saturated and may reveal an issue. And since we discovered that really the waveform and the vector scope are fairly mutually exclusive, I'm going to go ahead and see if I can expand the dynamic range of this. Now, we could go with the auto button. Sometimes the auto button works. It does a best guess. Let's take a look and see where that is as a starting point. It won't change the color. So it didn't really expand my contrast, but it just brightened up the image a little bit because it was fooled. It was fooled by the clouds. It didn't want, there's some really bright elements in the clouds and the buildings, and there's probably a couple spots of black. And what it literally does, it says, I'll make the brightest thing white 100 and the darkest thing black 0. And if there happen to be a couple of spots that are really white or really black, those tend to take control. So how would I work with this image? The first thing I want to do is I want to make sure that the overall exposure is correct. And we're going to go down through the entire Lumetri panel here, and throughout the next 45 minutes, make changes with that. I do want to step through the Lumetri panel just so you have an idea of what's there and what's coming. So when you first open it up, and I'm going to zoom in so you can see this a little bit better, the first tab is Basic Corrections. And this is where you can apply a lookup table if you shot something flat, which is, we showed you some of that earlier. I can actually go in and I could do a white balance sample if I've shot a gray card, if I shot a white balance card. And I can also manually control temperature. So I have two elements there. We worked with those when we worked with the sliders and the scopes. Then I can deal with exposure, my contrast, okay, so I can get a wider contrast. I can also deal with the whites and blacks and the highlights and the shadows. So what's the difference between those? Well, your whites and your blacks are your extremes. Say the upper 5% of the brightest areas and the lower 5% of the darkest areas. Highlights and shadows might go from 5 to 15% and might go from, say, 85 to 95%. So you can actually, make sure that your whites are fully bright, but you could take the highlights and bring them down a little bit so maybe the sky doesn't look as blown out. So that's the difference between these. And then if we scroll down just a little bit more here in this first tab, There's also a saturation slider because, as I said, you're working with luminance values here pretty much, so you may want to adjust your saturation as needed. I often don't do that in this top panel, and I'm going to zoom out so you can see where I'm stepping. So if you notice, underneath your main panel, there's, again, a bunch of other panels, and as you click on each of these, it closes the panel above it, or the tab above it, and reveals new information that you can work with. So you can really focus on what you need to. So the second one is your creative palette. And depending on your workflow, there's a couple of things that you can use this for. If in the first palette you completely neutralized everything, you're happy with the image, you don't want to take it to the next level, you can go ahead and you actually can apply different stylistic looks. So this is just like a quick fix. You can say, you know what, I'm going to step through. All I'm doing is clicking through these arrows, find a look that I like maybe, and of course I never balance this image. Maybe I want some sort of black and white. I can click it, apply it, and I could be done. I can also get these by scrolling down through this list. Okay, so I could say, you know what, I want blue steel on a blue. It's like, that's a whole, let's try something golden. Gold rush high dynamic range. So it just puts a different look on it. I generally don't use this till the end because I do a lot more color correction, but sometimes you just want to do things quickly. It's stylistic. This is not a lookup table, it's stylistically. So I'm going to go again and switch that back to none and just point out a couple of other things that are really nice and unique in a color correcting tool for most nonlinear NLEs. Nonlinear NLEs is a redundancy. NLE stands for nonlinear editor. So if I throw out jargon, send an email, send a message and say, Abba, what does that word mean? And I will say, I made that word up. It doesn't mean anything. Okay. So there's a slider if you want to create a faded film look. Again, I'm looking for neutral. I don't use that. But these three elements here I find very valuable. And if you look at those, there's sharpening. And sharpening will allow you to try to make your image look a little crisper. It's the same thing you would have for sharpening in Photoshop. It gives the perception of a sharper image because it actually gives more detail to the edges. You're not really able to sharpen something out of focus, but it does give it a little more clarity and a little more punch, but a little bit goes a long way. So don't go crazy with sharpening because you'll get this image that just looks too artificial. These are the two magic ones. And these will come into play more when we are dealing with people and fix the shop, but I want to point this out now. Vibrance and saturation. Saturation equally makes everything more or less saturated in your image. Vibrance is a lot more powerful. I think of it as smart saturation. What vibrance does is it will add saturation to the less saturated areas and ignore the more saturated areas, so everything kind of evens out. So if you have somebody with a bright red shirt and you use saturation, that shirt could blow out. But if it's a really saturated red shirt and you use vibrance, everything else could get more saturated, but it won't affect that really saturated shirt. It also tries to protect skin tones so people don't get these big red faces. So that's not a good thing. And then you can actually work with the shadow and the tint. This is basically if there's lots of blue maybe in your shadows and you want it to be neutral, you could adjust it, but we'll actually work through these. I wanted to show these two elements because these are the two primary areas that I work with. We'll look at the other elements as we continue through the class. So I have this really blue image. I did hit the button and try to do an auto balance. It did an okay job, but I know I want to bring in more dark here, and I may want to open it up a little bit. So the first thing I could do is I could work with exposure. I'm going to jump back to the basic correction tab. So if you've been following along and you followed me into creative, go back to basic. And the first thing I'm going to do, I'm not going to deal with temperature or color balance at all, is I'm going to make sure that it's good exposure. And I'm getting the exposure kind of in the middle. That's fine. But really what I want to do is I want to deal with contrast. And if I move my contrast to the left, lower contrast, you notice now I have a less dynamic range. So in this case, I want to add contrast. And I'm going to be gentle and pull this, because if I go too crazy, sometimes with some images you just get really crushed blacks and really blown out whites. So this is giving me a much wider palette as I expand my contrast. And I'll show you a little trick here. I'm going to zoom in. If you use the slider, it takes you up to 100. Premiere tries to protect you from really butchering the color and luminance of your image. But if you want, you can ignore the slider when you get to the top and go over here to where it's a virtual slider, and you can get a little bit more out of each of your sliders. So that's a little secret there. So I'm bringing the contrast up, opening that. It still is very blue. If I wanted to, I could take my blacks. I'm using that slider, bringing it down just so they touch the bottom. Okay, so you see it's just touching the bottom right here. And I'm going to add a little bit more white to it. So it just touches the top a little bit, just gives me my full dynamic range. Still is very blue. And if I wanted to, I could start working with shadows and highlights. But for now, I'm getting a little bit annoyed with how blue this is. I want to go fix that. I could go ahead and try the white balance selector, hoping to get one of these buildings. And I do, but you know something? It still's pretty blue. Okay? It's not guessing what's going on. So I'm going to go ahead and reset this. Anytime you have one of these adjustments changed, if you double-click on the actual circle, it'll reset to 0. I do want to point out that this is the Lumetri Color panel. For those of you who have been playing in Premiere, you are very familiar with the fact there is an effects control. That's how you normally work with any of your filters or effects. Guess what? You have your Lumetri panel right here with all of these corrections and sometimes a little more granular control, and your reset buttons, and if you can keyframe things, there's your little stopwatches. So as I make changes to the right side, it will make changes to the left side. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. As a matter of fact, sometimes what I do when I color correct is instead of having to switch back and forth between my scopes and my effects panel, I'll sometimes grab the effects control panel, drag it away. Let's see if I can grab it. I got it. There we go. And I will go ahead and I'll put it right next to my Lumetri color panel. So now I can jump back and forth here and there and the whole time keep my scopes up. So I do modify my workspace sometimes. If you do like that and you want to keep that, once you've created that workspace, go to Workspaces. We'll zoom in here, and you can save that as a custom workspace. You can call that Color Correction 2. Okay? So the eyedropper didn't work. The way the eyedropper works, by the way, just in general, is you want to click on something white, but not really the brightest area of the image, because there's no color in it. You want to click on something that's white or gray that is obviously influenced by the color temperature of what's around it. So that, you know, I would never click on clouds. I might click on a building. But this is just so blue and white. There's really no other colors there. I'm going to have to go manually. So I know there's too much blue, so I'm going to go to my temperature, and I'm going to just start bringing out as much of that blue and try to bring in some of the orange. And with my tint, as you see, I go back and forth. I'm going to go ahead and try to bring back some of that red. Okay, I'm going to get too much red there. And my goal to get this neutral is really to try to get these as even as possible, if I can, and to get this blob to be central. So, you know, I do have a little red spike there. It's kind of between the red and the blue. So it's just a matter of playing with these elements. I can see maybe that my luminance is too bright. So I'm going to take my highlights and bring that down a little bit. And I think my shadows are actually pretty good. You know, sometimes if I bring that down, so now this is punching. But I still don't quite have, you know, that full color that I want if I get too much red in there. So let me see if I can even cheat here. I'm going to bring a little more orange into it. And this is where you're getting really into subtle nuance. And, you know, we're looking at that and you're saying, it's okay, it still's a little bit blue, but I want to point out what it would look like without the filter. That's where we came from. That's where we got to. It's a little more usable. It was horribly shot, but you can work with that. And if you wanted to, you could actually go down into some of the other areas. So I could go down into creative. And instead of working with saturation, I could say, well, what happens if I throw a little bit more vibrance into it? Okay, so it's already pretty blue, but if you notice, it adds some color, but it doesn't really shift the color. It's actually looking a little more normal. And I probably would want that to be a little bit more gold. So I could go over here to my highlights, and I want it to be a little bit more away from the blue. So I click on the little dot, and I pull it a little bit towards the yellow and the orange. And that's going to affect my highlight area. And then if I wanted to work with the shadows and I wanted to neutralize those, if those are too blue or those are too red, actually I have too much red in my highlights. I'm going to pull that down a little bit. And the trick here is you want to pull it in the opposite direction of where there's too much of the color. So I see too much red and too much blue. So I really want to pull it in this direction. It's going to add green to the shot. So I have to be very careful because there's not a lot of color in this shot to work with. Okay? So I need to be pretty sensitive. Now, once you touch one of these, it becomes solid. And that way you know you've modified this parameter. If you double click on it, you'll get the hollow thing again, and you haven't changed any element there. Okay? Now I've done this, and this slider now allows me to say where I have, I'm going to give more weight to the highlight tint or to the shadow tint. So those are some elements that you will play with. And we're getting a much better image. Ultimately, I'll probably brighten it up. This is the fixed image. So as you noticed, if I brighten it up a lot more, you lose a lot of that color saturation, and it actually looks a little bit better. So again, that's the before. I'll go back to my basic correction, maybe open that up a little bit, clean it up. But you can see that with a little bit of work, you can go from that to that. I'm going to teach you a couple of tricks that I do when I color correct in Premiere, and this is really useful. As a matter of fact, this is worth writing down or buying the course. If I want to switch between windows, I can use the Shift key. Shift 1 will go to my project window. Shift 2 will go to my source. Shift 3, my timeline. Shift 4, my program. Okay? Shift 5 will actually go to my effects control. So whether your effects control is left or right, Shift 5 is a good key to know. But I also want to go to my scopes. Okay? And I may also want to go to my LumetriColor panel. So you can, if you go into the preferences, under keyboard shortcuts, I'm going to zoom in here, I can go ahead and I can say, you know what? I want to be able to jump directly to the LumetriColor panel, which doesn't by default have a key assigned to it. And you can pick whatever works for you. I picked 1. So whenever I hit the 1 key on my keyboard, it's going to take me to the LumetriColor panel. If for some reason I've switched over to looking at the image on the left side, and I want to get back to my scopes, I hit the number 2. So I programmed 1 and 2 for that. The other number that I programmed, and let's see if I can remember what it's called. I programmed it to be 3. It's down here. Let me zoom in a little bit. Bypass LumetriColor effects. So I can hit the number 3 when I'm in the Lumetri panel, and it will toggle off all of the effects so I can look at the original image. And remember, I said sometimes you have to see where you've come from and where you are, because if you keep looking at that image, you're always going to say it's a little too blue, it's a little too red, and you don't realize what a crappy image it was to start with. So those are 3 keys I programmed. Normally these are used for multicam. You can make a separate custom set if you want, so you can switch back and forth. But any key that's not being used that you can remember, those are 3 good keyboard shortcuts to assign if you're going to be working in color correction. So that's why I can, and if you haven't programmed it, you can't. If I'm over here looking at audio clip by accident or looking at the source, I hit 2, I get to my scopes. Okay? I hit 1, it opens up my Lumetri panel if that's not the active panel. And if I hit 3, it will turn 1 on and off.